minutes or so, and then we'll pass it off to Dr. Baetz. All right, so as stated, this is the first talk of the Cross-Division Trauma Speaker Series. The Trauma Speaker Series is a bi-monthly virtual speaker series. We're going to be featuring an array of both national and local experts in trauma. The topics are wide-ranging. There is a speaker series general handout that hopefully many of you have received, but if you need one, please, by all means, send us an email down at the bottom of this slide. That's our center's email, and we can answer whatever questions you may have. Anyone working with JJ-involved youth and families are invited to join us. We have a particular interest in inviting people that are active here in Cook County with the justice system. And our goal, our overarching goal of this speaker series is to raise awareness and increase the knowledge that folks have about trauma to try and build some degree of a baseline knowledge. So I want to tell you a little bit about how this speaker series was born. It came out of our broader Cook County Juvenile Justice Cross-Division Trauma-informed Initiative, which is indeed a mouthful. So back in 2021 and 2022, Northwestern University had the pleasure of partnering with 4 different divisions of the juvenile court in Cork County to apply the Trauma-informed Juvenile Court Self-Assessment Tool. Again, if that's something you're interested in knowing more about, by all means, please reach out to us because we would love to tell you. At the end of that process, we conducted focus groups and interviews with the people who participated. And the overarching recommendation that came from all of the different focus groups was we need to engage in cross-division collaborative work if we're to truly try to create a trauma-informed juvenile justice system, because there's a lot that can happen within any specific division, but there's much more that can happen once we start to work collaboratively. These are some of the activities that we engage in. So we have a planning meeting that is open if anyone's interested in joining. We meet monthly virtually. We have quarterly in-person large group meetings. Sometimes we meet once, sometimes we meet twice per quarter. This is where most of our work is done. These meetings started in June of 2023 virtually, and they became in-person meetings starting in November of that year because people got really eager to meet and know each other in person. That was meant to be a one-time only in person, but by and large, folks have really liked coming together. They felt that it's helped with the collaboration and the work. So that's what we will continue to do for the time being. Our Trauma Speaker Series is our newest piece of our work that we've decided to do together. And then we've also been supporting the curriculum Think Trauma, which is an NCTSN, National Child Traumatic Stress Network product. And we've been training trainers in different divisions of the juvenile court. Our outcomes to date may not sound, well, I don't frankly know how they'll sound to folks who have not been a part. I can tell you that it's a lot, and I'm not sure that it'll seem that way here on this slide, but we have had active participation from many different programs or divisions. On average, we have folks from about 9 or 10 different divisions attend each of our large group meetings. Our largest has been 16 different divisions of the juvenile court and/or partnering programs. During those meetings, we have accomplished a lot of ongoing in-depth discussion, carrying themes over from one meeting to another. We have developed a cross-division trauma-informed mission statement, which I will share with you in just a moment. We have just developed and will be disseminating on Monday is our next in-person meeting. So if you don't yet have an invite but would like to attend, please reach out. At that meeting, we'll be sharing our newest product, which is a gap tracking document. So we went back over the last year and a half and have consolidated and documented all of the different types of gaps in trauma-informed practice that have been brought to the table so that we can hone in on them one at a time and figure out how to take small steps towards addressing them. We've also started to pull together what we're calling a Bravo board, because when we started this initiative, there was already a tremendous amount of trauma-informed work going on in the courts. And what we learned is that the divisions are not always aware of what's happening in other divisions. So we want an opportunity to kind of share those successes and exemplify the trauma-informed practices that are currently underway. We've also started to coach and help people understand the concept of making tiny tests of change, because oftentimes system change, especially in a system this large, feels overwhelming and very difficult. So if we can find a way to do so in small individual ways, that is may be part of our way forward. And then finally, we have helped recently to have 20 different internal to the juvenile courts think trauma trainers who will hopefully now be available to train new staff and to train within their divisions and cross-divisionally. These are some of the aims of our trauma-informed initiative. So we've been focusing on developing cross-division relationships, cross-division collaboration, enhancing awareness and trauma knowledge, sharing and building upon the existing trauma-informed practices, collaboratively identifying and addressing trauma-informed gaps. And ultimately, this is all to build and to sustain a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. This is the mission statement. It is 3 sentences. It is lofty, and our team feels as though it is also something that is able to be accomplished. So we are committed to building a more trauma-informed system and to strengthen our collaboration with partners and stakeholders. Again, this is a mission statement that was developed cross-divisionally. We prioritize the importance of compassion and equity. We strive to utilize an anti-racist lens that promotes justice and safety for youth, families, and their community. And we share an ongoing commitment to purposeful discussion, reflection, and action to improve our ability to provide trauma-informed care. So I'm going to pass this off to Dr. Carly Baetz in just one moment, but first I do want to call attention to the fact that Carly is our first speaker, but not our last. So the speaker that we will host in March is Dr. Patricia Carrig, who is a national expert with regards to many different things that are trauma and justice, the intersection of those, but in particular on the impact of trauma on professionals. So up until yesterday, we thought we knew the date, but Patricia, or Dr. Carrig, has been subpoenaed to be in court on the day that she was supposed to present for us. So we are now trying to figure out a new day and time, and we will get that information as soon as possible. If you do not receive emails from us regularly and you would like to, please note that in the chat, and we will call attention and add you to our listserv. So it is now my absolute pleasure, I'm going to stop sharing, to introduce for you Dr. Carly Baetz. And I have a brief bio that I would like to share with you before she talks, although she may add some enhancements to make sure that we fully understand what it is she's doing. So Dr. Carly Baetz is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor in the psychology department of Purdue University Northwest. So she is now local. She also holds a faculty appointment in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Dr. Baetz has been the project director and the principal investigator on a federally funded grant funded by SAMHSA to expand trauma-informed services in New York City juvenile detention facilities. She has more than a decade of experience working with youth and families in the juvenile justice system, as well as the child welfare systems. Her current work focuses on treating youth who have histories of trauma exposure, those of whom are impacted by the juvenile legal system, conducting research on the implementation of trauma-informed practices within the juvenile legal system, and providing trauma-informed training and consultation to juvenile legal system professionals. Prior to becoming a psychologist, Dr. Baetz represented youth in child protective and juvenile delinquency cases as a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society Juvenile Rights Practice in New York. Dr. Baetz, I would love to just pass this off to you at this time, and we want to express our utmost gratitude for being our first speaker in this series. So it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be the first speaker in the series. It's nice to meet all of you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, so bear with me one moment. Let's see. Okay, can you see my slides okay? Perfect. Okay, great. Oops. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. It sounds like you all are doing a lot of amazing work with this trauma-informed initiative. So some of the things I'll be talking about today, I think sound like there are things that you're already striving to do or are doing in Cook County. This is especially exciting for me. I just moved to Chicago about 1.5 years ago from New York City. So I'm still learning the ins and outs of the Cook County system. So I'm excited to be able to sort of meet all of you virtually and hope to work with you in the future. So as Tracy mentioned, I've worked in various roles across different areas of the juvenile justice system as well as the child welfare system. I've represented youth in court as an attorney, but most recently I was working as a clinical psychologist in the secure and non-secure juvenile detention facilities in New York City, providing both direct mental health services to youth, families, and staff as well, staff training in trauma, and also overseeing a project where we were really trying to implement more trauma-informed and trauma-specific services for youth, staff, and families. So I'm going to be talking to you today about trauma-informed care in the juvenile legal system. I'm going to be highlighting a paper that I did with some colleagues a few years ago, really trying to nail down what is our definition of trauma-informed care in juvenile justice specifically. Before we get there, though, I would like to start off. I like to just sort of ground the conversation around trauma-informed care, really thinking about why we're looking at trauma-informed care. Why are we even concerned about making sure the juvenile legal system is trauma-informed? So one of the things that we've learned over the last couple of decades with lots of research now is that upwards of 90% of kids in the juvenile legal system have experienced at least one traumatic event. And some of the more common events that we see among kids are physical abuse, sexual abuse. A large number of youth that I work with, and I'm sure that you all work with, have experienced community violence or ongoing community violence in their neighborhoods. Racism, discrimination, separation from caregivers, exposure to domestic violence. So those are some of the few sort of major ones, but certainly many, many others that I haven't named. We also know that system involvement increases the risk for both trauma exposure, but also exacerbation of existing symptoms that youth may have coming into the system. And on average, the number of traumatic experiences that kids in these settings have had, so different types of traumatic experiences, not just one trauma, is greater than 6. So that's a large number when we're talking about kids, right, who on average are 15 or 16 years old. And around 30 to 50%, sort of depending on what study you're looking at, go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's compared to about roughly 6 to 7% in community samples. So we know that trauma impacts pretty much almost every kid that we're working with in the juvenile justice system. So I wanted to just share with you, I always like to start off with case examples to sort of ground myself in thinking about, okay, so what is it that we're specifically talking about? What does this look like and why is this important? So I wanted to just share a case example with you of a youth that might have come to my attention on our team in juvenile detention. And I'm sure that this presentation will also feel familiar to you all as well, given the work that you're all doing in the system. So we might learn, right, initially that Jonah is 15 years old. He's a Black youth and has an arrest for assault and also possession of a weapon. We also might learn that he has a history of 3 prior arrests for similar charges. And that he's reporting that he's using marijuana pretty regularly, about 3 to 4 times a day, and that this started around age 11. He's failing when he comes to us, he's failing most of his classes. He's not attending school on a consistent basis. He's when he's in the community, living with mom and his 2 younger siblings. Mom reports possible gang involvement. She's not 100% sure, but she suspects that he might be involved in a gang or at least hanging around peers who are involved in a gang, but definitely has frequent fighting in the community and also at school when he's there. So he's currently in detention. He's awaiting trial on his case, and he's not really doing so well in detention. So this is his first time away from home at all, ever. And he's getting into a lot of fights in the detention setting. He's refusing to attend school, and he's having a lot of difficulty sleeping. So think about, and you don't have to share, but just think about just knowing this information, kind of your initial perceptions of this youth, things that may come to mind, depending on the roles that, individual roles that you all work in, words that come to mind to describe this youth, things that you might be thinking about in terms of what his needs are, right? But then we learn, which is often the case, we might have this information about Jonah, but we don't know much else, right? And then if we are working in a trauma-informed system, right, we might be doing screening and assessment, and we might be looking at maybe some of the things that Jonah might have experienced in his life. So it turns out that he's been through a lot. So he has an extensive history of exposure to violence in the community. He reports being assaulted in his neighborhood at various ages multiple times. He was the victim of a drive-by shooting on his way to school at age 11, and he lost 2 close friends to gun violence over the last year. He also lost his grandmother around age 11. He was exposed to domestic violence around age 5, and has an early history of sexual abuse between ages 9 and 11. His mother did discover the abuse, and the uncle, the perpetrator, is now incarcerated as a result. Dad has also been incarcerated since age 5. And he also has, right, potential for further traumatization just being in the detention setting where he's at. So just think about, right, all of this new information, and think about, does this change your view of Jonah? And if so, how, right? Does this change your thoughts about some of the things that maybe he might need? Does this change your idea or thoughts about, okay, where might these behaviors, right, that are bringing him to the attention of the justice system, where might those be stemming from? Might trauma be a big part of that picture? So one of the things we know, right, is that trauma has a lot of potential negative impacts. I'm focusing on youth. Of course, this is true for adults as well. But I want to just highlight some of the main ones, right, and how those might be connected to some of the behaviors that we're seeing from Jonah. So we know that youth with trauma history, right, especially kids who have been exposed to chronic and ongoing violence, are often quite hypervigilant. So they're constantly looking out for danger. They might have a really difficult time trusting others, a lot of difficulty concentrating in school and otherwise. A lot of the youth that I worked with, when I would meet with them, they would never put their backs to a door, right? So that was always a consideration in terms of the treatment and the things that we were working on. Kids often are experiencing recurrent memories or images, maybe of the traumas that they've experienced. So this might come in the form of nightmares or intrusive thoughts. They also may have a lot of difficulty regulating emotions. So you might see this in the form of intense anger, guilt over the things they've experienced, sometimes guilt and intense anger and grief over things they may have done. Some of which may have brought them to the attention of the system. You might also see youth who are emotionally shut down, so very numb, withdrawn. And those kids, I think, are often missed in the system. Another potential impact is avoidance of internal, so maybe avoidance of certain feelings that remind that youth of something they've been through or the feelings that they experienced during a traumatic event, but also external reminders. So things like avoiding the street, right, where an assault may have happened, even if that's the street that you have to walk on to go to school. Difficulty trusting and engaging emotionally in relationships. This is a big one, and this can really have a lot of impact on the things that we're often asking youth in juvenile legal system to do, potentially, right? Meet with a therapist, work with a probation officer, report regularly to certain services. So that difficulty trusting and engaging in relationships might come off and appear like kids are not interested, or they're being defiant, or they're refusing to engage, right? But really, some of that may come from some of the trauma that they've experienced. Negative views of themselves as worthless or damaged, broken. These are some of the many things I've heard from kids. And reenacting traumatic experiences. So maybe for some kids, engaging in violence might be a reenactment of the experiences that they've had in their lives, or reenacting sexual behavior for youth who maybe have been exposed to sexual abuse. So all of this might lead to behaviors that bring kids to the attention of the justice system. Because when youth are experiencing trauma-related symptoms, they often are operating, especially when those symptoms are intense and chronic and frequent, they're often operating in what we call survival mode, right? Where their brains are operating as if the only thing that's important is survival. The brain doesn't have the resources at that point to focus on any other thing, right? So youth lose sight of maybe the bigger goals that they have in life, things that are important to them. And survival coping can then lead to exactly the kinds of behaviors that might bring youth in contact with law enforcement and juvenile justice. So things like aggression, impulsivity, running away, not going to school. Just to give you an example, in one of the evaluations that I was doing not that long ago, a youth told me that after he witnessed a few friends murdered in the community, on 3 separate occasions, he now automatically perceives anyone walking up behind him as dangerous. It doesn't matter who they are. It could be an elderly person. That to him is a signal that he has to do something, and he's going to turn around and throw a punch to protect himself before knowing really whether there's an actual threat. And that is a perfect example of survival mode. So when we go back to Jonah, right, and think about maybe how trauma might be impacting him and how some of the behaviors that he's exhibiting in his life might be connected to his trauma history, which is something that we wouldn't be able to even think about if we didn't know about these things, about his history. So things like substance use, right? So I mentioned he's been using marijuana pretty frequently on a regular basis since age 11, right? So here, substance use might be related to trauma. So this might be his attempts to numb, try to avoid maybe some strong emotions that he might be experiencing. Substance use, in my experience, working with youth in the justice system, is often something that kids use to fall asleep, because if they don't, they have nightmares, right? So I've heard, kids have said, the only way that I can sleep at night without waking up repeatedly from nightmares about the things I've been through in my life is by smoking marijuana. His fighting in the community and even carrying a weapon potentially could be related to that hypervigilance and hyperreactivity that I mentioned before, right? Attempts to keep himself physically safe. He's had extensive exposure to and witnessed community violence. So that might make sense, right? Now, of course, I'm not saying, right, yes, we want all kids to be carrying a weapon. That's totally okay. Not at all. It's just that having this information and being able to make those connections helps to open doors for us to really figure out how to best help kids who have experienced that level of trauma and really help them heal and find ways to really increase protective factors and help them really remember and meet the goals that they have for themselves. Fighting with peers and staff in detention, right? Something else that might be related to past and maybe even current traumatic experiences. So in this particular environment, I can only speak for the facility that I worked in, but it was a really difficult place even to work. So imagining being a kid in that setting, especially for the first time, it's often a physically unsafe place to live. So Jonah was coming into detention already hypervigilant, and that setting also then increased his hypervigilance, which would make sense that he's then fighting with peers, right, and staff, and potentially, doing that to protect himself in times even maybe when that's not needed. Refusal to attend school in the community. He was assaulted on the way to school. So I mentioned, avoidance of external reminders might be one symptom, or traumatic stress reaction. So for Jonah, this could be when he's in the community, the fact that he stopped attending school could be related to the fact that to get to school, he has to walk down the same street that he walked down when he was exposed to community violence and there was a drive-by shooting. So that makes a lot of sense. He also has some sleep difficulties, right? So we know that for a lot of kids, they might be experiencing nightmares, and this might interfere, of course, with sleep. And so this could be an excellent explanation potentially. Pretty much every kid I worked with in detention was having difficulty sleeping, and a lot of that was because of nightmares and intrusive thoughts that were happening even before kids were trying to fall asleep. And he's also got now frequent contact with the juvenile legal system, right? So is this related maybe to some of these behaviors that have a connection to his traumatic experiences and traumatic stress reactions? So before I get into more about trauma-informed care and sort of what that looks like in the juvenile legal system, and I'll talk a little bit about the paper, I wanted to also just mention that staff are also an integral part of juvenile justice settings, right? And we know now that trauma, both direct traumatic experiences and indirect traumatic experiences can have a negative impact on staff who are working in these settings. And they have an elevated risk for secondary traumatic stress, which I think Dr. Carrig will be talking about with you in the next talk in March, which is essentially the emotional duress that might result from learning about another person's traumatic experiences and from observing firsthand even a traumatized person, somebody who's been through a lot of trauma, observing their post-traumatic stress reactions. So this can result in that staff member even experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms themselves. And it can also be linked to impaired functioning, difficulty interacting with youth, with staff, with coworkers and families, and also an unhealthy workplace just in general. So knowing all of this, the increased research that's been done and increased recognition of how trauma can impact both youth and staff, as well as families in the juvenile legal system, has led to the application of trauma-informed care as a concept to the juvenile justice system. So trauma-informed care is actually not a new concept. It first came on the scene in 2001. And it was really applied to various systems well before making its way to juvenile justice. And essentially, it's an approach that really integrates an understanding of how trauma impacts us, the potential consequences of trauma, and really folding that into all services, all policies at the organizational level, and all practices that that system employs. So this really, trauma-informed care really views survivors of trauma through a public health lens, which really shifts the focus from what we're often, unfortunately, asking is what's wrong with a youth, right? It shifts that focus to what might have happened to this youth that might explain or better explain, right, the behaviors that we're seeing. So having this lens really opens doors for promoting healing. If we're only asking the question, what's wrong with you, right? What's wrong with you? Why do you keep doing this? What's wrong with you? We might get an answer, we might not get an answer, but it doesn't really provide us with any ability or tools to help. Whereas asking what happened to you, if we can get a sense of that, then we're able to really utilize more strategies for healing and empower youth, right, for their own healing. So for youth like Jonah, right, the juvenile justice setting really has the potential to potentially be further traumatizing. It may not provide any opportunity for him to heal and could exacerbate his symptoms, which then we know might increase his risk for recidivism. And at the end of the day, no matter what we are doing, what our roles are, right, within the system, reducing youth recidivism risk, reducing youth recidivism risk and trying to find ways so that they don't come back to the system or ever have to enter it in the first place has benefits for all of us, everyone, right? It protects the community, and it's also important for the youth and their families. But this is a big shift for juvenile and criminal justice systems, right? The juvenile justice system historically might have been more focused on punishment as opposed to thinking about things like, how do we help heal? How do we help youth heal? How do we help youth become more resilient and really focus on the strengths? So trauma-informed care overall, SAMHSA in 2014, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which has funded a lot of the work that I've done, came up with sort of a core definition of what trauma-informed care is. So, and this was not specific to the juvenile justice system. It's an approach that involves realizing that there are high rates of trauma among youth and families in the system, recognizing the impact of trauma on youth and families. So it's not enough to just know that there are a lot of youth and families in the system that have been impacted, but we also have to recognize what that impact is. A trauma-informed system also responds appropriately by taking that knowledge and putting it into practice to increase both physical safety and emotional and psychological safety within settings, and also resists re-traumatizing by minimizing any triggers for trauma or trauma reminders, right? So reducing the use of harsh and coercive practices that might be re-traumatizing for youth who have had traumatic experiences. So at its core, it really provides opportunities for survivors of trauma to increase their sense of control, increase their sense of empowerment, and really emphasizes, as I mentioned, physical and psychological safety for everyone in the system, not just youth, but staff as well. Everyone who works in the system, as well as youth and families. So trauma-informed care, as I mentioned, was applied to other systems before really making its way to juvenile justice. So in the beginning, and this was sort of around when I was entering the field, but in the beginning, it was clear that we really didn't know what this was going to look like in a juvenile justice setting. I can tell you definitely that in my prior role as an attorney representing kids in delinquency cases in New York back in 2009, 2010, no one was talking about this. So I think we've come a really long way in a short time, but we still are figuring out, right, exactly what this looks like and how that might be different in a juvenile justice setting as opposed to some of the other settings where trauma-informed care has been applied. So in 2015, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network put together what's now known as the essential elements, which are 8 elements. They're still referenced quite frequently today, very helpful just in thinking about implementation and practices. And so those elements range from making sure that all your policies and procedures are trauma-informed, identifying and screening all youth who enter the juvenile legal system who have experienced trauma, making sure that youth are maybe youth who score positive or high on some of those screening measures, then go on to receive a full in-depth assessment as well as mental health intervention. The 4th element, trauma-informed programming and staff education. So making sure that that's just the standard of care across all stages, the whole continuum of the juvenile justice system, that staff are being trained and receive education on trauma and its impact, as well as specific skills, right, to be able to apply that knowledge and put it into practice. Preventing and managing STS, secondary traumatic stress, is a really big one, really important element. And then partnering with youth and families. So making sure that we're engaging with the families of the youth who are in the system, right? And also the youth themselves, helping them to sort of feel like partners and maybe collaborate with them in terms of the programming that's being offered and the therapeutic mental health services that are being offered. Cross-system collaboration, I know that's one of the goals of the Cook County Trauma-Informed Initiative, which is amazing to be able to have that cross-system collaboration. We know that many of the youth who are in the juvenile justice system are also impacted by many other systems. So many youth that cross over, right, between the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. And so making sure that we're all talking, right? That tends to be a very siloed approach. And that's a really important part of being a trauma-informed system. And then making sure that we have the approaches that we're using for trauma-informed care in the system are really working to address disparities, reduce those or eliminate those disparities, and making sure that we're applying our trauma-informed practices, right, to all youth, to diverse groups of youth, right? Not just centering our services sort of on one type of youth, but making sure that we're recognizing the large breadth of different youth that are coming into the system, right? Different genders, right? Different sexual orientations, ages, levels of intellectual development, socioeconomic background. So making sure that we're taking that into account when we're thinking about services. So the essential elements, as I mentioned, were established around 2015. So a few years later, a few colleagues and I were starting to do some implementation in some various places within the New York City juvenile justice system. We were starting to do some trauma-informed implementation. And we realized that there wasn't, or didn't seem to be at that point, a widely accepted definition of trauma-informed care specific to juvenile justice. So many organizations and agencies had their own definitions. A lot of people were doing a lot of great things, but none of them were consistent or kind of overlapping with each other. So we decided to see if we couldn't find a consensus on a trauma-informed definition that was specific and unique for juvenile justice. And we also really wanted to find out if there were any recommendations out there that were consistent for the different practices, specific practices, because it's one thing to have a definition and to have the elements, right, that you want to address and have as core components of a trauma-informed system. But it's another thing, it's an entirely different thing when you're trying to implement services and practices along those elements, right? A lot of places really want guidance around, but what does that look like? What does this actually look like on the ground? So we were curious to see if there were any recommendations out there that were more specific for exactly how to do this and what specific practices to put in place. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of just the purpose of this paper and some of the methods. I won't bore you with a ton of information about the methods. They were quite boring and long, took a very long time. But then I'm going to share with you some of our findings, which I think are very relevant to what we're talking about today. So as I mentioned, many of the trauma-informed, there were trauma-informed definitions at this time, but they were really specific. They were either very general or they were very specific to different systems, but not for juvenile justice. So there was no consensus really on what practices or policies we should be integrating within this system. And many trauma-informed components cut across systems, but we know, right, there are specific challenges within the juvenile justice setting and also across settings that are very unique to those settings. And they didn't seem to be adequately addressed by those general definitions that we had. So it was really clear we needed to better understand the core components of trauma-informed care for juvenile justice. So our goal was to conduct a systematic literature review to identify the domains that were the most common among all the recommendations that had been published at that time, by that time, and what were the most common recommendations for trauma-informed care practices within, again, specifically the juvenile justice system. So we did a very, very comprehensive search of the literature. So this included looking at 10 different databases. We entered keywords including trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, probation, juvenile justice, and many others. We entered the same keywords into each of these 10 databases and basically looked at every hit that we got from those databases. So the first round of this was just whatever we got, we were looking at, right? We were at least going to be looking at their titles and the abstracts of those papers. And so these are all peer-reviewed journal articles. So essentially that means, right, that that these are articles that have been submitted by authors and they've been reviewed by, usually it's 2 to 3 reviewers who are experts in the field to make sure they are sound articles, right, worthy of being published. So we got 950 articles initially, and we looked through 950 articles. So that took a very, very long time. But essentially what we were looking for, right, we did a very broad search because we wanted to capture everything that could possibly be out there. But in the end, we only included papers that defined trauma-informed care and also provided additional recommendations. So if a paper just mentioned, trauma-informed care is great, it's the way to go, right? It's what everyone's doing, that was excluded. That wasn't helpful to our purpose. If a paper only just cited a pre-existing definition, so a definition we already knew was out there, but didn't actually give any additional recommendations, that paper was excluded. So you can see how we started with 950 articles, and in the end, we had 10 that were included in our final batch of articles for our review. And so from there, we took those 10 articles, we read every single one of them, took out, extracted the details from those articles, kind of pulled them all together. And the goal with a systematic review is really to be able to take sort of a meta view, right, of all of these articles, take all the information and synthesize it down into some major key points. And for us, we hoped to really have some recommendations for the field that were consistent and that there seemed to be some consensus on as a result of all these published papers. So in terms of just the definition of trauma-informed care, this was really striking to me. I remember being shocked that 71 different recommendations were present across 10 articles. That's a lot of recommendations. And so we parsed through all of those recommendations and sort of found at the end of the day that 8 of the 71 were included in the majority of the definitions given across those 10 articles. So I've listed those for you here. And you'll recognize a lot of these from the essential elements, right? Which really sort of mapped on to what we ended up finding in those kind of core recommendations. So universal screening and assessment, right, for youth, having evidence-based trauma-specific treatment available, being able to provide services for diverse groups of youth within the setting, providing access to social supports for youth and families, prioritizing youth preference for treatment, and staff training was a big one. So making sure that all staff are trained on trauma, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Also implementing policies that promote safety, both physical and psychological safety within the juvenile justice settings, and eliminating harsh and coercive practices. So those were sort of the core recommendations and the ones that were the most common across papers. And also just wanted to mention too that the authors of the papers that we ended up including really ranged from practitioners in the field to researchers and also some organizations. So the American Bar Association was one of them. The Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence was another that had recommendations in their definition. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Courts. So it represented sort of a wide range of both the types of authors included in these papers, but also kind of the positions of the organizations included in these papers. So so having these 71 recommendations, we were able to collapse them into 10 major domains. So 10 major domains ended up emerging from all of the recommendations that we saw in the 10 papers. And we were able to collapse those 10 major domains into 3 categories. So that included clinical services, so recommendations about clinical services, recommendations that were related to the agency context, and system level recommendations. So I'm going to share with you now within each of those 3 categories, the different domains and some of what we found in terms of across publications. So domain 1 was screening and assessment. And this was a very clear consensus in across publications. Universal screening for all kids, followed by a more in-depth assessment for kids who then end up screening positive, was found as a recommendation in all but one, so in 9 of the 10 publications, universal screening was recommended. The second domain was services and interventions. And we found the same thing. So in all but one of the publications, the recommendations were calling for justice systems to really make evidence-based, trauma-specific mental health interventions widely available to both youth and also families involved with the system. There were also around 7 recommendations that were given regarding the types of services, so specific services to youth in both community-based and detention and correctional facilities as well. And then domain 3 was cultural competence. So there were 6 publications of the 10 that recommended policies, procedures, and also clinical services, any programming for kids should address the needs of diverse groups of youth and avoid or reduce disparities related to race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, developmental level, and socioeconomic status. 3 of the publications also included recommendations for gender responsive or specific programming to specifically meet the needs of girls involved in the system. And 3 of the 10 publications called for services to be tailored for the LGBTQ population of kids. So the second domain is within the agency context. So we had 4 domains that fell under the agency context recommendations. So domain 4 was youth and family engagement and involvement. So 7 of the 10 publications had recommendations that promoted engaging youth and families in the system. Other publications also recommended adding or increasing and providing access to more social supports for youth and families. So supports in the community for both the kids within the system and also their families. There were a lot of other recommendations within this area. So trying to prioritize youth and family preferences. So if youth had preferences, let's say for male versus female therapist, right? Or sort of a type of treatment that they wanted, prioritizing that preference, although obviously we can't always meet that, but making sure we're at least hearing from youth and families about what those preferences are. Workforce development and support. So this was a big one. I mentioned staff training before, but I just want to highlight this again. So providing staff training on trauma, sorry about that, was the only unanimous recommendation across all 10 publications. So it was definitely a core element of trauma-informed care across all of those publications. So there's a lot of complete consensus on staff training on trauma being a core and essential element of trauma-informed care in the juvenile justice system. What wasn't as consistent was the type of training topics. So interestingly, there were a total of 15 different types of training topics that were recommended across these publications. So those ranged from things like trauma-informed care principles, right? So just knowing what those are, specific skills for working with youth with trauma histories, the impact of trauma on youth development and behavior. And there wasn't a lot in terms of recommendations for following up with staff after training, right? Providing consultation, providing supervision, making sure that staff are using models with fidelity, right? There was actually surprisingly not a lot, if any, guidance or recommendations on that. But generally providing staff training on trauma was in all of the publications. Domain 6 was promoting a safe environment. So again, restricting or eliminating the use of harsh or coercive practices. Those were the most common recommendations within this domain, and also promoting respectful interactions between youth and staff was also in 4 of the 10 publications. And then finally, for agency context, domain 7 was really focused on this. This had fewer recommendations across publication, only about 3. But those recommended that agencies and systems really institutionalize their commitment to trauma-informed care by embedding those trauma-informed care principles within their policies, and also encouraging leadership, agency leadership, to embrace the approach and build that approach into the organizational value system with things like mission statements and purpose. And then finally, for domain 8, so the third category of system level recommendations. So cross-system collaboration, just like in those essential elements and with some of the work you all are doing here. Cross-system collaboration came up in 5 publications, really calling for that coordination with other service systems and providers that work with youth offenders. Some of the recommendations that were specific within that area were working with other community stakeholders to make sure that trauma-informed services are available throughout all local child service systems, right? I know one of the things that we always ran into in the setting that I was working in was that the detention facility, we had a lot of trauma-informed practices in different areas of the facility, but then when youth left, there was no continuity of care. So there was no coordination across systems. And there was also, obviously, again, a lot of silos between like the youth, right, that I was working with who were in my system in the detention facility, who were also involved in the child welfare system. And that was improving with things like the crossover youth practice model, but still a lot of siloing and lack of coordination across systems. Domain 9, system level policies and procedures. So 5 publications recommended policies that really just tried to minimize or at least reduce youth's contact with the system at all. So trying to keep kids out of the system, and if they were in the system, policies that really tried to support them being in the least restrictive environment. And 4 of the publications recommended policies that would ensure that any information about a youth's trauma history is used to connect them with services and used to build strengths as opposed to being used against them in court, which I know is something I hear defense attorneys and prosecutors talk about sometimes, right? And just like who has access to that information, and if everyone has access to that information, is there there's a worry oftentimes, right, that might be used to argue for a higher level of care for a youth. So some of these publications were recommending policies that would make sure that that didn't happen. And then finally, domain 10, quality assurance and evaluation. So 3 of the publications called for ongoing data collection and evaluation of the process and the impact of implementing trauma-informed care in systems. So focusing on things like youth outcomes. Is what we are doing in trauma-informed care, is this making a difference for kids? Is it reducing their risk, right, for coming back to the system? Is it improving mental health outcomes? And also monitoring for racial and ethnic disparities in access to trauma-informed care. And I think I mentioned this before, but only 1 publication really called for ongoing monitoring and supervision for staff around implementation of trauma-informed practices and services, which I think is only 1 publication talked about that, but I think that is a very important piece because in my experience, I know oftentimes staff are trained and then they're kind of sent off to do without a lot of support and consultation and ability to sort of problem solve and troubleshoot. So I think this domain 10 is really something we're also doing now, right? This is kind of building an ongoing set of data and being able to evaluate these different practices and even the essential elements to think about, okay, what's working, what's not, and why. So just some of the takeaways. There was, as I mentioned, consensus around some of these core domains of trauma-informed care in the juvenile justice system, with a little less consistency in recommendations for specific practices. Unanimous agreement, right? Staff training on trauma should absolutely be a part of any trauma-informed care implementation, with a little bit less consensus on specific content. And the most common recommendations across publications that we looked at were that universal screening for trauma, evidence-based trauma-specific interventions for youth and families, and then, of course, promoting youth and family engagement within the system. So I also just wanted to highlight a couple of the resources that have come out since the essential elements and since the paper that we published. So there are now, and I also put the link down here, the NCTSN on their website has a specific section for juvenile justice, which has a lot of great resources for helping to really fill that gap, right, between knowing about trauma and its impact, and then what do we do with that information. So I just posted, 2 examples here. So there's an NCTSN bench card for judges, for the trauma-informed judge. But I think even if you're not a judge, I think it's still a really helpful resource for kind of seeing, how to really implement some of this knowledge and put it into practice. And then there's also, I mentioned that one of the core recommendations was evidence-based trauma-specific mental health interventions for youth with histories of trauma. And so there is a resource, I believe it was just updated in 2023, that really kind of helps provide some information about what that is, what those look like, what are the evidence-informed interventions that we can be using within these settings. And Tracy, I know you potentially wanted to talk a little bit about the juvenile court assessment. Did you want to do that now?
You know what, Carly, I think that I would prefer to defer to focusing on what you've already presented today, and then I can loop around to that at the end if we have time still.
Sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all I have. I think we have some time for discussion and questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything I've talked about or otherwise.